Hello, folks. This is Carly, Chief Executive at Driving Instructors Association. I just wanted to give you a little update for both our members and driving instructors and motorcycle instructors in general, because we don't just represent our members when we do this work. We're there to represent the industry and everybody in it on the lobbying and campaigning activity that we've been undertaking on your behalf this month alone. Because throughout the year, you will find us doing our damnedest to make sure the voice of the instructor is heard where it matters most in terms of the development of policy, legislation, and strategy. And being the biggest association in the space, and with the biggest mouth, and with the biggest amount of experience, quite frankly, of getting into the rooms that we need to be into to talk to the people that we need to talk to, DIA is more prevalent in these discussions than even the National Association Strategic Partnership. That's simply down to the fact that we are, quite frankly, better than any other association at getting into these conversations. And also because our membership spans much more than the traditional, kind of ADI zone that people think of in terms of just training learners. We're there and we're very clear that we're there to represent every type of trainer in every vehicle and license class and in every context as well. And that's what our membership numbers speak to as well. So we get where we need to get to have the conversations is the point that I'm making there. That's not to be dismissive of other people's efforts, but the reality is I don't see other ADI associations in these conversations at that much higher level. And DIA has that benefit that we can do that job. And one of the conversations that we've been involved in this week is a discussion with ministers about the minimum learning period. And this is something that I really want to urge you all to get involved with yourselves because you have a perfect opportunity to get involved in that conversation by responding to the formal consultation. Now, the minimum learning period consultation is part of the road safety strategy that was announced by government this year. First time we've had a road strategy actually published in a long time. It's an imperfect beast. It's great that they've launched it, but it is an imperfect beast. I wrote to ministers as soon as it was launched to point out that actually there's quite an absence of a key stakeholder in that entire strategy, as in it doesn't talk about driving instructors once, and driving instructors are massively important to the delivery and dissemination of road safety strategy in the UK. And they're doing road safety on our busy roads every single day. So how can you have a conversation about it without making instructors preeminent? But that just plays to our gripe with government that driving instructors are disregarded, much as we make great efforts to make sure you're not, but they feel disregarded and they feel disenfranchised from consultations such as these, from discussions that affect their pupils and their own lives as a professional. But be reassured, we are trying to be where we should be. And this Monday's roundtable was evocative of the fact that we get where we need to be. So that was a consultation exercise, part of that. Can't go into too much detail because that was a meeting held under Chatham House rule. I can talk about what we said because they are all things that we've said publicly already about minimum learning periods. So the things that we talked about to ministers were that we would be very concerned that in their proposals, if there was a minimum learning period, that was signed off by anybody else other than an approved driving instructor. One of the things I pointed out, again, this is in the public realm. I've talked like this before, so I'm not revealing anything from the meeting that is confidential. I talked about the fact that it's absolutely ludicrous in the United Kingdom that we pat ourselves on the back for a learning to drive context and delivery program, when really it actually is quite mad when you think about it, what we do. Because what we do is we require the professional, the driving instructor, to go through a mandatory training regime to be licensed and to be scrutinised and to go through DBS checks and all the training and all the costs and all the investment they have to put in. And then we say, once we've established this mandatory licensing regime for driving instructors, two things. You as the pupil can decide not to engage with that professional in any way, shape, or form and do your own thing with your parents who are arguably novices themselves in the context of learning to drive. You might have driven around as a parent for 25, 30 years. Doesn't make you an expert on driver education. It doesn't make you an expert on driving. I'm the mum of a 15-year-old girl who's shortly learned to drive, probably better placed than my partner to deliver some level of private practice because he had one driving lesson back in the 80s, 90s, whatever it was, and I had at least 45 hours with my instructor, and I work in the sector. However, I wouldn't be so arrogant as to think that I could do a better job, which is what some parents think, than a driving instructor. But the government sets us up to fail with that one. They set us up to believe that having a mandatory system will make more people use an instructor and that everything's hunky dory and everybody's using them. But the reality is, as I pointed out on Monday, what they base their policy making decisions on in terms of the reality of how many lessons people have and how much private practice people have is actually flawed because we don't consistently collect data where we could do very easily at the test centre from pupils about how many lessons they've had and how much private practice they've had and whether they've learnt with an instructor. And again, that's a part of the system I think is utterly ludicrous and I do not shy away from calling that out. DVSA has more than a little capability to get every pupil to submit information on that subject. And I think policymakers are surprised when you tell them that that information is not consistently collected. That data is based on random surveys at points in time, asking people what they did in terms of their learn to drive. It's not asking every pupil in the UK consistently what they're doing. So trends are not necessarily being picked up on a regular basis, and the sample size is quite small that they're using. So one of the things we want to urge DVSA to do better in the future is collect better data on the learn to drive programs that people are undertaking if you want to base solid policy and strategy making on those figures. And I think that fact was quite a surprise to even some road safety stakeholders around the table because even the academic researchers, I think those figures are more robustly collected than they actually are. The other ludicrous thing that we wanted to point out, whilst we've got the opportunity in these kind of discussions, is what I've just started on back there before I got distracted with other waffle about the collection of data. You know, we ask you guys to pay and invest and become licensed, and then we say you can learn with somebody else. And then we say you can learn whatever you want to learn, by the way, because there's no mandatory curriculum. And that is why I call that system ludicrous. And we should all be calling it out. We should all be calling for something stronger than what we've got if we want the UK to truly be considered a road safe nation again, because we've fundamentally slipped quite far in those rankings as other nations overtake us in evolving their novice driver training and learner driver training. So those are some of the things that we wanted to get across from the get-go in any consultation on the pre-test period was we are allowing people to do what they want and learn with who they want. And whilst the majority of people will use an instructor, there is downward pressure on those instructors to teach people as quickly as they can for the least money that they can and to grab them a test whenever they can. And now we're actually taking the instructor's ability away to control when that person takes a test to some degree for the greater good of keeping that person safe and meaning they don't leap for a test too soon by effectively blocking instructors out of the booking system, which is another thing that we raise in consultation with government ministers as well. And I'll move to in a moment another piece of lobbying that we're doing this week on that subject. So we raised the spectre of how ridiculous our learning to drive journey actually is in the UK and how much better we could do with that. We acknowledge that minimum learning periods could be a good thing, but we don't like the inclusion of an accompanied driver signing off what could be, a learning program based on hours or competencies. As I said at the start of this diatribe, a parent is a novice when it comes to driver education. They are a driver and they are fully licensed, but they are a novice when it comes to driver education and training. So fundamentally, if we accept that a company driver should be signing off a pupil in the same level of authority as an approved driving instructor, that very much undermines the approved driving instructor and what they've done to become licensed. And it very much gives credit to a parent knows about driver training, which they don't unless they're actually a driver trainer of some sort themselves. So we very much do not want to see parents being able to sign off competency or hours in this kind of scenario. That's something we strongly put forward in this particular workshop. I can't speak to what other representatives thought of that. It was broadly supportive. And I think those who may have even thought that accessibility, i.e. letting parents do as much as they can to reduce costs and increase accessibility, was better. And we had to worry about that more than safety. But I think by the end of the session, we even shifted their minds to the fact that accessibility should be less of a worry than road safety and making sure the right person is signing off the right level of competency. The other thing that we wanted to get across very, very strongly was the fact that we don't feel it should just be a bunch of hours that people accumulate. That's not necessarily proven to be the most effective thing in other countries that have adopted that. And there are problems with the fact that, people can just sign any old thing off, or they can be doing hours of training that aren't focused on the key areas of risk that we really know that novice drivers actually have. Some countries have a time-based pre-test period requirement, and there is a loose curriculum applied to that, but it's not necessarily a mandatory curriculum, and not everybody's clear on what they should be doing, neither trainer nor pupil. We believe strongly that in the UK, if you're going to introduce a minimum learning period, it has to have some shape. It has to have a curriculum, and pupils need to be working towards key competencies versus just pure hours. Pure hours, a number of hours are important. If people don't necessarily understand why an hours-based program is important, or a period of time, that's because the research is showing us that the more time you try and find yourself exposed to learning to drive, the more time in the learning period, and actually the older you get, the closer to 18 you get versus 17, is better in terms of safety outcomes. So there is a big, strong argument there from the academic researchers and the likes of TRL that the more time people spend in learning, the better. However, we want to see the shape to that learning. Otherwise, we may fall foul to the kind of behavior from some trainers and pupils and their parents that doing lots of things like maneuvers in car parks and cul-de-sacs and stuff on private land in private practice, and some trainers being guilty of just taking people around suburban routes near a test centre versus where they should be taking them into higher risk areas like rural roads and high speed roads, and other situations that are high risk. It's not going to be effective to just have an hours based program. That's why you've got to get them focused on key competencies. And given DIA has already taken the time and the thought and the imagination and some level of financial investment from DIA, even though it's part funded by DFC, the funding is never enough to actually deliver a program of that nature. We had to invest ourselves. We've already created something like that with driver milestones. So, not to blow our own trumpet, but we came up with that concept. We consulted with you guys, we consulted with academics, we government supported us in that. That is a working framework based around the key areas of risk, a competence-based program focused on the key areas of risk for novice drivers, and to expose them to learning in those specific areas of risk before we give them a license. It isn't covering every area of learn to drive. That would be impossible. It just focuses on the key areas of risk like distraction, adverse conditions, speed, all of those kind of things. Driver behavior and psychology is a huge part of it. And the reality is we don't have that curriculum at the moment. We've got the national standards and we've got a safe driving curriculum to some degree, but none of that is mandated for somebody to train and somebody to actually learn. And I think that would be a much more effective way of superannuating the position of approved driving instructors to have the power to do that training to that curriculum and sign it off and assess it, because milestones, we have a program of ADIs being assessors in that as well. So that would free up resource and the pressure just on one driving test and one theory test. But it also ensures a lot of learning outside of lessons as well through e-learning, which is something that the sector has been admittedly quite slow to take on board, and is a way of making that extra learning accessible at zero or low cost to the learner, and not taking away time from lessons as well. So if you haven't already had a look at that, have a look at driver milestones, because that's what we are saying is the model for what a minimum learning period should look like. And although it will naturally require a number of hours of learning to ensure they have adequate exposure and experience and time to acquire that, it will allow pupils who are competent to move more quickly and not restrict their accessibility by forcing them down a road which is hours based only. And that brings that kind of learning into chime with other areas of vocational skill acquisition and skill acquisition in other areas of life, that we don't necessarily say you've got to do X amount of hours and no shape to what you'll learn. That is more akin to how people would acquire skills in other areas, to have shape to what you learn and guided learning hours to learning that. So have a look at that. And we're certainly saying in the minimum learning period consultation, that's what we want to see. We want to see ADIs only signing off any competencies or periods of learning. And we want to see shape to that learning as well. And we want to see something that actually addresses a ludicrous situation of having a licensing system for driver trainers, but the pupil can choose to do whatever they want, really, realistically, to go and get that driving license. It's just ridiculous that you would have these frameworks and not use them. So those are the kind of things we discussed in that session, and I do believe that our points were taken on board quite strongly there. And as the only driving instructors association or ADI body that was in the room, it's important that our voice was heard in those particular debates. I've also written to ministers this week on behalf of the National Association Strategic Partnership. And in that letter, we are asking them to think again. I know some of you have attended the webinar from DVSA, and it seems very much like the booking platform changes are a steamroller that is going down the track to be implemented in spring. And it is likely that they will continue to ignore the concerns the driving instructors and driving instructors associations have represented to them about that blocking of driving instructors out of the system having a longer term consequence for road safety. However, I would be remiss, and my colleagues would be in representational roles, if we did not have a last attempt to try and a continuing attempt, actually never give up, to try and get DVSA and DFT to reconsider some aspects of that strategy. Or if not in the short term, in the longer term, and place a promise on this to review the impacts of not having driving instructors able to book tests if we see some issues post test with pupil safety, because pupils have fundamentally been given free rein to just choose when they want to go to a driving test. And if they can't get their instructor, they'll do it themselves. So Aegeus, as you saw in one of our newsletters, released a piece the other week saying that they fear as an insurer, as a consequence of blocking ADIs out of the booking system, you'll see more DIY tests happening. Pupils choosing when they want to go themselves, and if they can't get their instructor to go, they'll just go on their own, and they won't necessarily have the learning or the refresher learning they should have. If they can't get their existing driving instructor or any driving instructor, they'll just go to test by themselves. So that gives us real concerns about long-term road safety. If you give all choice to the novice consumer, which is mum and dad as much as it is the pupil, we are prioritizing pupil wants over road safety needs, and that's essentially what this letter is saying that I've put together on behalf of the industry, and that we would really like DVSA and DFT to reconsider that opinion on that basis. The other thing we're asking for is answer the question about the balance on that consultation. It was never a fair fight, that consultation, because you were asking the public, of which 120,000 people responded, as opposed to, which is pretty appalling on our side, quite frankly, 7,000 ADIs who responded to the consultation from our sector. Now, 44,000 place millions of public stakeholders. We're never going to have a fair fight in terms of numbers. But if we'd have had more people from our sector bothering to fill out that consultation, there would have been more weight to our opposition as an industry to these changes to the booking system. However, there is a very real challenge, and we keep making it. I first raised a challenge from DIA's perspective, but my colleagues in NASP fully agree with this challenge. We're not convinced that whatever DVSA say about how they balanced the responses to the consultation, there was a fair balance. That although we only replied in smaller numbers as an industry, we are the experts on learning to drive in the UK. So the consideration of ADI views should have been weighted much more heavily than that of the novice driver, which is the parent, and a novice driver educator, which is the parent, and the novice, which is the pupil. So we want reassurance that you did weigh that balance, because we haven't had a tangible reassurance on that factor yet. There was something that was supposed to come out of that consultation. Now, that consultation's results came out in a rush, and the plans were implemented in a rush, and that's not that usual. It seems very knee-jerk what happened there. What's supposed to normally happen is there's supposed to be an output impact assessment happens. There's supposed to be an input assessment that happens during consultation that looks at, if we do implement these measures and public opinion or stakeholder opinion sways one way and we go with that, what's going to be the impact on road safety, on the ADI, on the industry, on all of these things. That happened, that pre kind of and during consultation impact assessment. It was alluded to that an output assessment was undertaken after the consultation results were in. We've never seen the results of that. So I'd like to see it to believe it actually happened. Sorry to be so controversial, but that is my role as a lobbyist, is to poke and poke and poke until we get satisfactory answers. And that's what we're doing here. We want to see how that balance was applied, and we want to see how that consideration of the road safety risks and the risks and impacts on driving schools in the United Kingdom, the fee-paying, tax-paying, kind of businesses and individuals, how has that been weighed post-consultation? And there is an argument in itself, as one stakeholder said in a very fraught meeting about this consultation, that wasn't a consultation, it was a referendum. We didn't know we were voting on policy that was actually going to be implemented straight away as a result of that consultation. If it's deemed a consultation, we expect that after the responses are in, the industry and stakeholders get to have a conversation with government about, yes, the numbers might look like that in terms of what the public wants and what the ADI wants, but we've got to really consider what's for the greater good here and what will be about decreasing road safety risk rather than counteracting a rubbish booking system that should have been tackled years before COVID, and things that DVSA could have done to counteract these issues, including getting more supply driving tests to the front line than they actually did. So that letter will go out. You'll see it in your newsletter, members of DIA, and we'll put it on Driver Trainer as well to ask ministers to give us some comfort around those issues that we've kept asking about and not necessarily received comfort thus far, and give us comfort that as well that if we notice that there is a decline in safety standards by allowing the pupil to be the priority in terms of their want to get a driving license quicker versus the need we have, which is to make sure only those who are ready go for a driving test, and taking away an ADI's ability to police that to some degree, that we'll have a review of that decision making in the longer term as well. The other thing we point out in that letter is it was extremely unfortunate and maybe an unintended consequence, who knows, with a cynical head on in these days and times, that the ADIs were made out to be one of the bad actors in the booking system. And again, I have still to see tangible evidence that that was a significant factor, because the numbers that I'm aware of ADIs actually doing anything nefarious in that booking system are extremely low. And to lump ADIs in with third party actors, such as the bots or those who aren't even driving instructors selling on tests, or actually fraudulently selling on tests that they haven't even got, is extremely unfortunate and contributes yet again to driving instructors in the United Kingdom feeling further disenfranchised from decision making, but also now penalised and told that they're a part of the problem, when the reality is it was a tiny minority. One of my team, Sarah Everett Skinner, remarked that it was a case of one bad person in a class does something wrong and the rest of the class gets punished for it. And that's not fair. We should have dealt with that through the fit and proper procedures, which they'll say that they did, but then they still penalise all driving instructors with this move. And there are some driving instructors who are sitting there who are quite unhelpful to this debate, quite frankly, because they say, well, I don't book test my pupils anyway. I don't really care. It's not really going to affect me. Think about it in those terms that we've just described. If you are not able to be an effective gatekeeper to the test, then that further contributes to the ludicrous situation that we have in unbridled access to a driving license to a great degree in the UK, that you can do your theory test, you don't need a driving instructor to train you, and then you can go straight off to that test centre. And we hope that that test is the barrier to getting a driving license. But we know that there are some drivers, particularly in the high risk category of 17 to 35-year-old males, who have been driving before they even had a provisional license, either in rural communities, on private land, or just driving illegally without a license, who have accumulated enough experience on the road nefariously that they could actually fluke a driving test and be driving around on our roads. So we shouldn't be making that driving test itself the final gatekeeper. We should actually be allowing ADIs to have a much stronger role in gatekeeping, not just access to the test, but driving licenses in their entirety. So enough waffle on those subjects, but please, 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 please. We saw what happened with the booking system consultation. I get the feeling of cynicism that what's the point of responding to consultations because they just ignore us anyway. Yeah, but you make yourselves easier to ignore if you're not actually having your voice heard and you come in such few numbers. In this minimum learning periods consultation, please make sure your voice is heard. You've got till the middle of May to respond. We will be making a consultation response. We've held focus groups with members. We've done a survey. We've done a lot to make sure that we gather your thoughts and put them into the consultation from a DIA point of view. I'm attending meetings on the subject, with ministers. That direct access is really important. However, you need to be there in the numbers responding to that consultation and giving your thoughts on how that could work best as well. Otherwise, don't complain when there's change and you don't like it. So that's it on those bits and pieces this week. The other bits of lobbying that we've done, I've been working with a charity called Fear Free, who are lobbying for mandatory safeguarding requirements for driving instructors, which DIA was the first organisation in the driver training sector to raise the spectre that safeguarding training being absent in the training process was a real risk to the instructor and to the pupil. Don't think about safeguarding as just about protecting the pupil. Think about safeguarding training as protecting you as a professional because it's designed to educate you about the things that are a risk to you and the pupil in the training environment and what to do about those risks to mitigate them. So, DIA isn't just about flogging you a course on safeguarding. We raise the issue that DVSA needs to look at its safeguarding policy for examiners and frontline staff because there are issues sometimes there. The industry itself needs to look at the safeguarding risk to the professional and the pupil, and the lack of any training mandatorily in the ADI qualification or the motorcycle trainer qualification was actually staggering if you compare what you do to teachers and other trainers in other sectors. So fear free, this charity is campaigning for mandatory safeguarding training for ADIs, which is something we would support, quite frankly. It should go in the ADI qualification. And also for ADIs to become a position of trust. Now, that's happened in Scotland. ADIs are subject to the scrutiny that other positions of trust, like teachers, are, and they're campaigning for the same in the UK. So I'm meeting with them next week to flesh out their knowledge of our sector, because in some of the things they're campaigning for, there are slight concerns. They're not as cognizant of what already happens around instructor conduct already. And you'll see that in my statement in the member newsletter on this subject this week, but also in ways that we can work with campaigning organisations like that to share resources, share thoughts, and share learning to ensure that there is that increase in safeguarding awareness in our sector as well. So lots going on from a lobbying and campaigning point of view, which is probably why you won't see us, unfortunately, at industry expos and events. We'd love to be there and have their place, but as a campaigning organisation and as a full-time membership body for members, we have to prioritise servicing members in that respect and the industry versus kind of the promotional aspects, to our detriment sometimes. But we work on that as best we can. But we feel that we promote our credibility as an organisation and promote ourselves best by going out there and speaking to the outside world about what we should be doing in terms of driver training to make our roads safer, and the role of the ADI and the motorcycle trainer versus lots of internal and introspective events. So that's what we've been doing on the lobbying side. I will update you on all of those things very soon, and how that consultation is progressing in terms of minimum learning periods and how whether we've had any impact around the booking system, and thoughts on that. The last thing I'd like to say as we go into the weekend, and given the context that we're in this week of the conflict in the Middle East, I'm fully cognizant of the fact that some of our members will have family in the Middle East who, will be very concerned about the issues occurring there at the moment. So our thoughts are very much with members who are affected by this directly. And if there's any support that we can give you either via our help desk or in any other way, please do let us know about that. DIA obviously owns Diamond Advanced Motoring, and we do quite a lot of training in the Middle East. We train everybody from the Royal Oman Police to the new public bus service in Oman, through to oil and gas employees across the Middle Eastern region. So we work very closely with health and safety boards in the region, and this is obviously a very scary time for trainers and stakeholders in that world. But if there's anything anybody thinks we could be doing to support our members in that respect and try and help our members with their fears in regards to the conflict, please do let us know. With that said, and try not to end on a negative note, best wishes for the weekend. Keep safe out there. Thanks for listening, and thanks for your participation in our crucial lobbying work by sharing your thoughts and views with us, and getting behind some of our campaigns by sending the letters we use to MPs and sending videos on like this to colleagues so they're aware of everything we're trying to do, but also what we'd love you guys to do in terms of getting involved in campaigning too. All right, take care out there, everybody. Bye bye.